Hello and welcome to this very special presentation from the IPA. The issue, of course, is net zero and the harm it's inflicting on the Australian economy, on our jobs and the destruction of our energy system. Today we have a very special guest in the Baillieu Meyer studio to discuss that, none other than Dr. Benny Peiser of the Global Warming Policy Foundation, the UK-based think tank that has done such sterling work for over a decade now and who is touring Australia as a guest of the Australian Environment Foundation. I'll introduce Benny in a moment, but first I'll also introduce the man who doesn't need an introduction, the Director of Policy at the IPA, Gideon Rosner.
Great to be here, Scott, and welcome, Benny. We're glad to have you here, my friend.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
And Benny, you've been in Australia for this week, as I say, as a guest of the AEF and speaking to audiences up and down the eastern seaboard. What have you found about the net zero issue in Australia?
Yeah, I think what is interesting, you're about 3 or 4 years behind us in Europe. 3-4 years, everyone was so in favor of net zero. Everyone campaigned for net zero. I mean, all mainstream parties, all conservative parties, and hasn't gone down very well recently. So yes. I think you'll find out in a few years that energy bills will go up, people will become angry, and parties will struggle, because that's what we're facing now in Europe.
Absolutely, and of course, long before net zero has become the beast that it is, we've had the green schemes and we've seen the effects of that, and you know our energy bills have already doubled, and no doubt they'll double again, as you say. And I want to stay on this idea that we're behind because your Prime Minister Boris Johnson is not renowned as a policy person, but he is renowned as a salesman. And I have a theory that in many ways Australia adopted net zero by 2050 as an official policy, very much with the encouragement of Boris Johnson personally to Scott Morrison, our Prime Minister, in advance of the Glasgow summit. This is the classic pincer movement where Boris Johnson, as host of the Glasgow summit, was working with the UN to try and lock all parties into net zero by 2050. Right. And he convinced Morrison two things. First of all, that this was what it was going to be agreed at Glasgow. And the second is, if he wanted access to the nuclear submarine technology that the UK has in partnership with the US, then this was the sort of thing that one had to sign on to. And Morrison bought it. He got played by a very, very good salesman. But that didn't happen at Glasgow, did it, Benny? It wasn't.
Well, this is the whole problem. You know, the Western governments are all talking to each other and putting pressure on each other, and they manage to convince or press the prime ministers into, you know, these targets which they think they can sell as a big success. But of course, we know that the rest of the world couldn't give a monkeys about these targets. I mean, the Indians are saying, yeah, we are also doing net zero in, 2070. And by the way, we need about $1 trillion per year or something like that. And if you send us the check, we'll sign up to it. So the whole thing is a conversation just among the OECD countries, thinking that somehow if they come up with these targets and these policies, the rest of the world will follow. But they've tried it for 30 years and have failed, and there is absolutely no chance in hell that China, India, and the rest of the developing and emerging countries will ever follow. It's not going to happen. And anyone who still thinks it's going to happen is delusional. The Chinese have made absolutely clear that energy security and the cost of energy is their top priority, and that will remain so for decades to come.
And if only we had energy security as our top priority, Gideon.
Well, that's right. I mean, what I'm interested in is, yes, net zero, but also, you know, the lead up to it. This has been a fad in the West, carbon emissions and climate action for a very long time, for about a decade or two. What I'm concerned about is that there will be a significant lag period between the growth of this environmental sensibility and the decline in our production base for baseload power. I mean, in other words, it'll get a lot worse before it gets better.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's being accelerated now in Europe through the war in Ukraine because this lag is shrinking very rapidly. Energy prices essentially have doubled over the last 12 months. There are growing concerns that might triple by the end of the year. And the crisis is so severe that roughly a quarter of the British public or households will simply be unable to pay the energy bills. And of course, in that situation, most energy suppliers will go bankrupt and the energy sector will have to be nationalized. And that's a real prospect.
And what about capacity? What worst case scenario, when this unfolds, will governments be able to bring excess capacity and excess production back online, or what sort of runway do they need to do that?
Well, you'll be surprised to hear that the first thing the government has said is they've written to the energy companies that still run coal power plants and please, can you not shut them down? We need you. We need more coal for longer. And that's and the other thing is saying, oh, perhaps we should build a new coal mine. So there is a good chance that
you can't do that overnight, can you? I mean, there's
you can do that overnight.
Oh, you can. Oh, well, that's good to know.
Yeah. You just need to basically say, here's the green light. They start digging. It's
in Australia, it takes like 7 to 10 years, thanks to the environmental regulations, which has been part of the IPA research.
I think that has already more or less been done. These kind of it was held up because of COP26 and because of the green movement and so on. But when push comes to shove, all of this goes out the window, and you can do things like.
Yeah. So, sorry, Gideon. I just want to stay on this point. So, we're 3 to 4 years behind. That sounds about right. And on our timeline, the conversation is getting more and more concrete. So one of our major energy producers has announced that it intends to close one of our very large power stations in New South Wales, Soaring, by 2025. And as we keep pointing out, that's like tomorrow. And that will have a devastating effect on the wholesale energy market. But then by about 2030, the closure of baseload power stations in Australia will account for something like, I think it's 31% of the installed capacity in the relevant markets. So I can envisage a scenario, exactly as you say, in about 5 years' time, when the prices have doubled and there's panic about security and everyone's wondering where the powers are going to go, that the government will start to be writing letters saying, please don't close the power stations. By which time it'll be too late. So.
For some power plants, it will be too late. Some will be perhaps mothballed.
Yes.
I mean, in Britain, the energy minister is always proud to blow them up, so you can't bring them really back. But, some governments might just mothball them, close them, mothball them, and if there's a crisis, they can easily. Some people are telling me here that I'm far too optimistic. It's not 3 to 4 years, it's more like 2 to 3 years. But you're trying to catch up. I can see that. All your mainstream parties are singing the same from the same hymn sheet. We've had the same in Britain. And unfortunately, like Gideon said, it will get much worse before people wake up.
What about oil? It's one thing for coal and for the electricity bill, but if you look at the price of petroleum in particular, the price of gasoline, that has caused enormous unrest everywhere from France with the Yellow Vest movement to Kazakhstan we saw earlier this year. What about global oil production and the impact on petrol prices? Where do you see that heading in the medium term?
Well, that's a slightly different ballgame. Because you have OPEC, who are trying to keep production at a certain level to make more money. You saw what's going to happen in the US, in that the Biden administration is all over the place about oil and gas. They are trying to block as much as they can. On the other hand, Biden is begging the oil industry and the gas industry to drill more and get more out of the ground because his approval ratings are sinking. So he needs more oil to stabilize the price. So we are in the midst of a severe energy crisis, and whenever that happens, all the green thing goes out the window.
So thinking ahead, from what you're telling me, there seems to be an undercurrent of realism among Western governments now that hasn't been there before, and we're probably behind that 8 ball or behind the curve there.
yeah.
So will that stick, or will we resume normal programming and get back to this, on a political level, back to this green faddishness and blowing up gas plants and so on?
Yeah. Well, that's a good question. My personal view is that the current generation of politicians are essentially incapable of going to some kind of energy rationalism or realism. I think they grew up for the last 30 years with this green religion. They're vetted to it. They can't really give up on this. But there is a pretty good chance that the younger generation coming up now and living with the cost crisis, cost of living crisis, energy cost crisis, they are confronted with these kind of different concerns, and they might have other priorities than the previous generation. So my personal view is we will see a new generation of political leaders who will make energy security, the cost of energy, cost of living, their top priority, not the climate agenda.
And what I suppose remains to be seen is, will that be seen within the established parties, or will that be new political forces? And I say that at the same time, we've just seen Marine Le Pen reach 42% of the runoff election.
Yeah.
Not a win, but 4 in 10 French people voted for her. How much of that was due to rising costs, and what was her line on the energy crisis and so on?
Well, she's all over the place. Let's put it there. So it was a protest vote, no question. I mean, I would have got 40% to stand against Macron. It was and her policies are completely inconsistent in many ways. Yeah, she is basically, when it comes to economics, a socialist. She made the case that she would scrap all the subsidies for wind, but she was fairly close to Putin, and she clearly would prefer some kind of being a bit like Angela Merkel, so in between the West and the East. She doesn't like to be too close in with NATO, and so she. But what is interesting with the what is really interesting, and we discussed this yesterday at the event, because people are saying all the young people are being indoctrinated and have been for 30 years, and that's what they're being told in kindergarten and in school and university and on the ABC every day. And what people didn't realize, that the vast majority of young people, first-time voters up to 30, voted for her, for Le Pen.
It's a very interesting...
And the same happened in Germany, not for the populists, but the majority of young people in Germany did not vote for the mainstream parties. So I would really think we need to inform the education minister something is going wrong with the education. They are not doing the job properly.
Hey, Napoleon, never interrupt your enemy when they're making a mistake.
Yeah. So in this battle for the hearts and mind of the next generation, what I find, Benny, and I'm sure you do too, is let's say they not so much that they didn't buy into the green religion, but some of them actually heard so much of it at school and at universities that they're actually reacted against it. So they're trying to apply a rational, common sense view and understand something like the energy system, which is not difficult, not simple. And one of the things they get is, of course, the noise generated by the shills for the renewable energy lobby. So, for instance, the companies that are closing power stations are saying, well, we have no choice because we can't make money in the market. And they go, aha, the market is driving them out, not government policies. How do you get the story across that the market has been destroyed by the renewables? And two-part question then. And then further noise, they're told, but the solution's in batteries and hydrogen and new technology.
And CCS.
Yes, because these are rational, enthusiastic young people, and they're getting this constant barrage of message that, you just got to be forward-thinking and innovative, and coal is the past and nuclear is the past. So where do you even start with that?
Well, the first thing, it's very interesting. The market, as you said, is completely distorted because of the prioritization of renewables. And what it means in Europe is that actually no one is building conventional power plants. Never mind nuclear, because it's simply too uncertain and the returns are just not there. So the energy companies have told the governments, look, we're not building any power plants, so you can forget it. Now, what did the EU do? They declared that natural gas and nuclear are green energies, right? They're green, they're sustainable, and that means we can subsidize them. So basically, because governments are putting all their eggs in the renewables basket, they can only incentivize or convince investors to build conventional power plants, which they need anyhow for backup when the wind doesn't blow. And they say, okay, how much are you willing to give us? So conventional power plants are heavily subsidized. Now, the consequence...
Sorry, I'm going to interrupt. So the hack for the politicians is that it's too hard to take subsidies away from renewables.
Yes.
The only way to ensure a halfway decent energy system is to also subsidise.
Everything is subsidised.
Everything. So
but you listen to this. Now the industry comes and says, hold on, you're making energy so expensive, we can't afford to compete at that level with the global market. We need subsidies. So people have to pay for subsidies for renewables. People have to pay subsidies for the backup. People have to now subsidize conventional power plants. And now we have to subsidize industry just to stay in Europe. It's a complete mad system.
It's a bit like Ronald Reagan's old axiom about government. If it moves, tax it. If it keeps moving, regulate it. And if it stops moving, subsidize it.
It's exactly that. So we are in a quasi-socialist environment where the markets no longer function. And when it comes to energy, definitely there is no market. It's all down to the ministers deciding who gets what. And the end of this game is almost certain that the whole system will have to be nationalized. And then you have a proper socialist economy.
Go the whole hog.
Well, are we at the point, though, where that might be a better outcome? So this is of course, deeply distressing to any organisation like the IPA, which fundamentally believes in the power of markets. But to have reached this point, a mere 25 years since the energy market was created with all the benefits it promised and that could have delivered if it hadn't been destroyed, are we now at the point where it's possible to argue that is the lesser of two evils, to not socialise it, but just, okay, it's government control then?
Well, it might have to come to that because the companies will go bankrupt, essentially, and you have to provide heat still and electricity to households who can't otherwise. But this would have to be heavily subsidized. I mean, the taxpayers will have to pay for it, but it's perhaps less regressive than the current system. Excuse me. And we are in a bad way. We know, of course, what nationalized energy systems mean. It means less efficiency, more costs, less reliability, the whole shebang. But we are reaching that situation. Some countries might avoid it, and we'll have to wait and see how it pans out. We're in a very bad way.
Yeah.
You are, of course, blessed with all these kind of resources.
We're not using any of them.
Well,
we're exporting them.
Yeah, I know.
I
know. And the irony is that Europe is still sitting on vast reserves of coal and of natural gas and shale gas. And again, the Europeans don't want to make that get their hands dirty and think that importing it from Russia is a nicer thing than digging it out domestically.
Can you think of a single Western developed country that's getting energy policy right at the moment?
Well, the US obviously is the only country because it is so deeply partisan and divided on this, and the Republicans are much more realistic on energy, and they have these states, the Republican-run states, that are not going for this green religion. So I think the US is, and they realize how important energy is for their geopolitical status. So I guess of all Western, despite Biden being the president, this is a temporary thing, and it doesn't really affect the states that much, the individual US states. So I think they won't give up that easily, like Australia is more delusional.
It is. And sorry, I just the other thing about the US, you referred to the shale gas, or in Australia we have coal seam gas, and a bit like America. So the shale gas and oil revolution in America happened because it happened away from sight. It happened in
and away from the majors,
away
the
from
big
the majors. The coastal elites didn't know anything about it, and before they knew it, Obama was bragging about the fact that America had turned around and become an oil exporter because government had nothing to do with it, and that happened in Australia in Queensland with coal seam gas. Coal seam gas was, to be frank, it was the shitty source of gas that nobody else wanted. None of the majors were interested. Companies got involved. Tremendous. It's now an export industry. And then the Greens found out about it, and so of course in Victoria, in New South Wales, it's been complete anathema, and they've shut it down. And so now we're getting very short in our domestic gas market. So it's and of course it was banned in the UK, and now you're desperately trying to resurrect that.
That's right, and at some point it's going to happen, and I'm pretty sure it's going to happen in Australia. It's just a question of time before the pressure on governments will be such that they will turn around and tell the Greens to shut up and go home.
Please.
So we've sort of touched very briefly on the vulnerability of Western Europe to Russian gas supplies as a result of them crippling their own energy supply. In Australia, our obvious geostrategic or geopolitical threat is the Chinese Communist Party. What would your message be to Australians about the national security implications of this green chicanery?
That's a good question. I mean, the irony is that the biggest trump card the West has, the biggest by far geopolitical trump card, is the vast energy resources in countries like Canada, the US, Australia. And that the governments of these countries don't play their trump card and shooting themselves in the foot instead tells you something is going wrong. The Chinese, that is their weakness, that they are heavily reliant on energy imports. They have coal for perhaps another 30, 40 years. And that's it. That's it at current consumption. And they consume quite a lot. Their coal deposits are, limited. Not like Canada or the US, where they're almost indefinite, huge, massive. I don't know exactly what the situation is in Australia, but I wouldn't be surprised. It's also worth a few hundred years, at least. So, and believe it or not, even Britain is sitting on a kind of black gold mine. They discovered offshore coal 10 years ago or something, and they estimate it's somewhere between 1 trillion and 23 trillion tons, so would last for 1,000 years.
Well, there you go.
But it's offshore. But what the point I'm making is that we know from history that most of the big wars in the 20th century were fought over energy. Energy will be one of the most, and of course IT, but IT is easier to, transfer and develop and so on. Energy will be one of the most important, if not the most important resource for energy security around the world. And if Western governments in the US, in Canada, in Australia, in Europe don't realize how important it is, they will damage their own position and throw away one of the most important cards they hold.
How can for example, our defence community, our intelligence, strategic policy experts, how can governments not get the message?
Unfortunately, the way governments work is that they are basically telling these agencies what they want to hear. It's not like Russia, but it's not that very far from Russia that governments say, look, we are driving policies and you better. I mean, in the UK, it goes that far that they are telling the armed forces to decarbonize, right? I mean, it's a complete and utter joke that the Air Force and the Navy and the tanks should, I don't know, powered by solar.
Wait till Tesla starts making fighter jets.
We have a retired Governor General in Australia who's set up a think tank with that mission to convert the military into that kind of nonsense. And even short of God forbid conflict, just to stay on China. So the game has become, and you'll put it better than I can, but so they're short of resources, energy resources. They buy it, God bless them, buy their coal and LNG from countries like Australia. But the game is that they've encouraged the policies that drive up our domestic energy costs. So manufacturing then shifts from Australia to China. So the gullible Australian public is happy because our emissions are tracking down, not because we've done anything great, we've just deindustrialised. We've then sent the fossil fuels that could have powered us domestically all the way to China so that they can be used in manufacturing power plants. And incidentally, to manufacture the solar panels, tremendously energy-intensive production process, which they then sell back to us. I mean, that's a hell of a trick, really. You've got to admire the Chinese.
No, absolutely. You couldn't make it up. I mean, you couldn't have a better policy. And the Russians do the same, because like the Chinese, they say, look, first of all, forget about your economy and your manufacturing and your energy. We can help you. We can provide you. We can sell you coal and oil and gas. That's the Russians. The Chinese are doing the other game. They're saying, look, why are you producing all this expensive stuff at home with your high energy prices? We have cheap energy, which we basically burn, and we produce. I mean, the biggest joke of all is when the Europeans started with the green agenda 30 years ago. That was their original plan. That they said, okay, they thought, we're running out of oil and gas. Renewables will be the future. We will become the energy superpower in Europe of the 21st century. We will become the green superpower. We will basically, first of all, have these green targets and the laws, make it legally binding, and then we will export the kind of legal system for decarbonization, and then we will become the exporter of solar panels, and wind farms throughout the world will sell the Chinese all the solar panels. That they didn't even think for a second that the Chinese can do that for half the price, and that instead of Europe inundating the world with solar panels, they've been completely inundated with Chinese products. I mean, it's all gone pear-shaped. And, well, we are in this mess because of this wishful thinking.
Yeah, and Danish companies, Danish wind farm manufacturers like Vestas are going to have their Goldwing and all these Chinese companies are going to eat their lunch.
Of course.
Yeah, and I mean, what you've just said, the green energy superpower, I mean, that is entered in the Australian lexicon in the last sort of 2 to 5 years. But you're saying it has a longer history in Europe and it's gone awry.
Yeah, well, people are saying, where is this coming from, this green cult? Because it's kind of quasi-religious cult. And of course, there are energy reasons. We had the oil shock in the 70s, and then some countries went for nuclear. The Greens were dead against nuclear, so they told the public the solution is renewables. But then you also have the decline and the collapse of Marxism in Europe, and the decline of traditional religion, and the green movement has filled this hole, this gap, with a new faith-based ideology, which is we can save the planet through these kind of utopian dreams.
Well, green energy superpower, Gideon, to pick up on your phrase. So the latest indulgences that the green religion can buy is hydrogen.
Yeah.
I mean, that is the story about the green energy superpower. The next sentence is always now about Australia is going to be huge in hydrogen. We're going to be exporting somehow masses of this highly flammable
Which to me sounds like a reheated version of the promises we were given by Kevin Rudd about geothermal and wave power and things like that. I mean, what's the deal with hydrogen?
Well, let's put it this way.
Firstly, just for our viewers who are laymen, when we talk about green hydrogen, what exactly are the opportunists talking about when they're selling us the snake oil about green hydrogen? What even is it?
Well, obviously, hydrogen is not a source of energy. It's created either through mainly other forms of energy. So you have to create it. So it's very costly in the first place. But politically speaking, it is an attempt by governments to protect what they think is still necessary, natural gas. The Greens are, of course, against that. They think we can generate hydrogen through wind farms and solar panels, which is a complete nonsense economically and technologically. But governments, and particularly the gas industry, is using it to survive. They're saying we will still need natural gas for hydrogen. Remember 10 years ago, the coal industry tried to survive by saying we'll create CCS, carbon capture and storage. We can solve all the CO2, we'll just put it in the ground. They spent tens of billions in the US. Obama pulled the plug because it doesn't work. And of course, the same with hydrogen. It's never going to work. You might theoretically, in decades to come, create through nuclear energy, produce it through nuclear, but I very much doubt. This is a game governments and industry play to prevent the worst, just to delay the
So again, taxpayers' money, it will flow into demonstration schemes and pilot schemes.
Just to keep the Greens from shutting down now the gas, because they went for coal first, now they're coming for gas. How do you protect what governments realize? Without gas, renewables are finished. Let's put it this way, because you can't use nuclear for backup. So. And this is interesting in Europe that, people saying the gas price is so high, it's 10 times higher than the US. Part of the reason why gas prices in Europe are so high, apart from the crisis in Ukraine, because that happened already long before the crisis happened in, is when you prioritize renewables and you phase down coal, all you have for backup is gas. So the gas demand has gone through the roof because all the governments need more gas to back up renewables. Without natural gas, you cannot run on renewables only. It doesn't work. We don't have batteries. They don't exist, these batteries. I think you've got a battery that's worth 3 minutes or so of.
Yes, it's ludicrous. And it's a shame you don't have longer in Australia, because we could actually take you to the battery in Realism, which caught fire and left a toxic plume over the suburbs. One of the many flaws in battery technology. But I'm glad you raised it, Benny, because that is what they are promising is the answer as backup to the intermittency of renewables. They won't accept this reality that gas is the only thing that allows it to work. Oh, we'll get rid of gas too, but we'll have batteries.
Yeah. Well, of course they will promise. They will always come up with some kind of new technology sometime in the future. They then try it and throw billions at it, and then eventually say, well, it's not really working. And people have crunched the numbers, how many batteries or how much capacity would need and how much it would cost. It would cost about 2 or 3 times the GDP of Australia.
Yes.
And technologically they are non-existent. Non-existing, and it's unlikely that they will ever exist. We're talking monumental forms
we're back into the realm of fundamental laws of physics, aren't we?
Absolutely.
This idea. So we have, software. People who've made billions in software who think that
you could do the same with batteries.
Yeah. That it's simply a matter of enough smart people getting in a room with a whiteboard and crunch and writing code, and magical things happen. But an energy system's not like that, is it?
No, and batteries not like these. So we are talking about a utopian policy that is fundamentally based on wishful thinking and pie in the sky, 10, 20, 30 years ahead. It's a bit like fusion. It's always but fusion is a more realistic energy form.
At least if
absolutely. And at some point it might be always 30 years in the future, as at some point it might actually work. Renewables only don't work and will never work, and that's just a matter of fact. They will never ever work.
Why do you say it will never work?
Well, because they're intimate.
The technology might be there one day. Why will there not? What's the impossibility behind that level of technological development?
Because they require the backup. You need basically 25 to 30 days of storage. If you get rid of all fossil fuel generated power plants, you can only have a renewables-only electricity system if you have enough storage for those periods when there is no wind or very little wind, no sun. Okay? You can build 1 billion solar panels and 1 trillion wind farms and then double that again, and you still won't have any electricity when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine. So you need the storage. And this amount of storage is currently, and I very much doubt any time this century, able to be created, built technologically. Yeah. These batteries are, we're talking something that is so astronomical that it's, I think, technologically, never mind economically viable.
Indeed. So, and Benny, that's brilliant. And I wanted to reflect for a moment because you're so passionate and knowledgeable, and you've been at this for a while. So the Global Warming Policy Foundation you set up with Nigel Lawson, now Lord Lawson, who was Margaret Thatcher's Chancellor of the Exchequer, in 2009.
That's right.
And so congratulations on a tremendous achievement of being so focused, and you've got the curse of Cassandra. You've been proven right again and again. But what have you learnt over that journey, Benny, about the communicating, about researching, influencing government policy?
Right. Well, thanks for your nice words. We haven't been really achieving anything. And for 12 of these 13 years, no one wanted to listen anyhow. What is changing now in Britain in particular is for the first time MPs, backbench MPs, but also some senior ministers are beginning to be more concerned about the political economic cost of the policies than they are concerned about climate change. And what we've learned is that we are in a situation where facts no longer matter. Facts and arguments do not count in this environment. Because people don't want to actually engage in a kind of pro and con type of debate. That has gone out of the window. Most media don't want to do this anyhow. There is no real scrutiny or balanced debate. This doesn't exist. People have very strong views, at least the kind of political elites and the business elites. They don't want to listen to anyone who might cause them to reconsider. So this is not happening. The only thing we have come to realize that is focusing people's mind is when they are confronted with another scare, with another fear. And the fear that is now almost overcrowding the climate fear is the political and economic fear of a severe crisis, the cost crisis. For the first time, really, ever since we set up, and I would say for the first time in 30 years of green wishful thinking, people are confronted with the fear of huge economic repercussions and pain. And that forces them to prioritize. What are my bigger fears? Am I more concerned about climate change or more concerned about surviving the next winter? And that is the only thing that makes them think.
But even then, the propagandists are winning in the public. I mean, the argument's being made by political parties in Australia right now. With energy costs going up, we need to embrace more renewables to bring power prices down and blah, 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 blah. You know the drill. How do you reverse that?
You won't reverse it until the proverbial hits the fan. So
or the wind turbine.
The wind turbine. So the dilemma for countries, for well-off countries, well-developed countries, is that people will not listen to any of these arguments until they're hit hard, which is why the better off you are in Australia or in Europe or in America, the greener you are. There's a kind of very strong correlation between your economic status and the kind of green ideology you adopt. In Europe, the wealthiest parts of cities are always those parts with the highest green votes. So because we have the luxury of living in these kind of wonderful countries, we can afford to have these crazy politicians making a misery out of policy. But it's not going to change, as you said, until it gets worse. And it will get worse. And this is, the cycle we've seen almost throughout history. Governments mess up, they destroy economies, and then someone else has to clean up afterwards. And I don't expect anything else.
So if there's anyone in Gen Z who has an interest in energy, there you go. There'll be a nice little mess for you to clean up, because the baby boomers and Gen X have comprehensively stuffed it. So that's what we can look forward to over the next
Scott.
4 years. Oh, no, they're all your followers, Gideon. Inspire them.
And us millennials, I have to say as well, we cop a fair share of the blame. We went to see An Inconvenient Truth when we were in high school and, believed it.
It's been downhill ever since. Benny, thanks so much for that. Thanks to the Australian Environment Foundation for bringing you into the studio and for bringing you to Australia. There's a lot to chew on there, some great advice and some perhaps a glimmer of hope that we can actually get something more sensible.
Yeah, eventually. I have no doubt there will be a new generation of political leaders who will have to clean up.
Very good. And thank you, of course, to Gideon Rosner.
My pleasure.
Do you want to give your show a quick plug for...
Yeah, that's 4:30 weekdays right here at the IPA on Facebook and YouTube for the duration of the election campaign. Tune in.
So Scott Hargraves signing off for the IPA for this special presentation on net zero and the idiocies associated with it.